I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. CAR T-cell immunotherapies seek to harness the body's immune system to fight tumor cells. The promise of this new class of therapies has ignited investors' imaginations, but a new report from Vantage argues that the enthusiasm that has driven valuations of CAR T companies should be tempered by an eye toward the risk. We spoke to Jacob Plieth, report author and senior reporter for Vantage, about the promise of these therapies, what we know about their safety and efficacy, and why the muddy intellectual property landscape is a concern. Jacob, thanks for joining us.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about a new class of cancer immunotherapies called CAR T therapies. These are garnering a lot of investor enthusiasm, but as your new report notes, there are reasons to be cautious, particularly given the rich valuation of some of these companies. Let's start with CAR T itself. Can you describe what these are? How do these therapies work?
Well, I suppose fundamentally they work on a very simple principle, and that is to modify T cells in a patient's immune system and to make them target cancer cells. So that as a sort of principle is fairly basic, and in fact scientists have realised the potential of the T cell as a sort of weapon against all sorts of disease for decades. But it's only been recently that they sort of hit an effective way of targeting cancer using this approach, and that's basically the result of refining the way that the T cells are modified and to express a sort of artificially generated receptor on the surface of the T cell. And in fact, this approach, that in the last couple of years, we've seen some amazing responses in certain patients with certain types of cancers. So basically what they're doing is they are transfecting a patient's T cells to make them express this artificially generated receptor called the chimeric antigen receptor, or the CAR receptor for short. And that receptor interacts with a particular antigen on tumor cells, and that leads to, in some patients, to very fast and efficient cell killing.
Well, these are not off-the-shelf therapies. How are they produced, and are there ones that are manufactured for any patient without customization?
Well, you're right in that the most advanced ones are not off the shelf. So, for instance, the therapies being developed by Juno Therapeutics, Kite Pharma, Novartis, sort of three most advanced ones. They're all autologous therapies. So basically, this involves a fairly complex manufacturing process whereby a patient's T cells have to be removed from his blood, then they're sent off to a specific lab, and then they are transfected and grown up before being reinfused back into the patient. So that's a sort of complex procedure that takes a number of days in most cases. However, earlier on in development, there are a couple of companies that are actually aiming to develop an allogeneic or off-the-shelf approach. And indeed, some people think that if this were to be successful, this would really be a big advance in terms of mainly in terms of the cost and convenience of this type of therapy. But as I say, I mean, these are earlier in development at the present moment.
Well, you mentioned a moment ago that synthetic modification of patients' T cells are not new. It's been an effort that's been ongoing for 20 years. But what's happened to change that and ignite all of this sudden enthusiasm?
Well, effectively, I think the scientists hit upon the right type of construct of this chimeric receptor. I mean, the scientists have been messing around with different designs of this receptor for a number of years. And I think I think some of the early constructs lacked specificity. They mainly lacked efficacy in terms of stimulating a sufficiently potent T cell response. And I guess what you've had recently is if you look at the structure of this receptor, they've hit upon this co-stimulatory domain, sort of intracellular domain, which there are basically two main types which are in development at the moment. But they have been able to show far greater activation of the immune system than before. And the other thing that's happened is that they've hit upon the right sort of extracellular construct, which target and also that they found a very apt target, the CD19 antigen, which happens to be expressed on a number of hematological cancers, which effectively meant that you've got this sort of the low-hanging fruit, these initial sort of childhood leukemias and some B-cell lymphomas, which have provided a real opportunity now, these CD19 expressing cancers, a really good opportunity to show efficacy with these therapies.
So we talked about investor enthusiasm, but how enthusiastic have people been? We've had several IPOs, Juno, Kite, Bellicum. How easy was their effort to go public, and what kind of valuations are we seeing?
Well, the enthusiasm certainly, as of the end of last year, was huge. I mean, I was at if we start with Kite first, Kite floated in the middle of last year, and they raised, I can't remember off the top of my head now, they raised, I think, about $150 million. And then basically coming into the ASH meeting, the hematology meeting in December, the enthusiasm just grew and grew. And what ended up happening is that Juno and another company, an earlier stage company called Bellicum, floated on the same day just after ASH finished, and they raised the IPOs were way oversubscribed. They upscaled them, they raised the price, they raised more money than they wanted to. In addition to that, Kite did a follow-on financing, and there was just a massive surge of enthusiasm. On the first day of trading, Juno rose by something like 30 or 40%. So, the enthusiasm. It's hard to remember this level of biotech investor enthusiasm. Actually, you probably have to go back to about 1999 or 2000 of that sort of genomics bubble to see that kind of enthusiasm. I have to say, it wasn't entirely unwarranted, because, as I say, the responses that these companies are getting in some cancers, in some patients, have been nothing short of astounding. But I suppose it was my contention that actually the enthusiasm had run away with itself, and a lot of these companies were being valued. Their fundamental valuations were unrealistic. Juno, for instance, was worth, I think, almost $6 billion at one point. Which for a company with what is still an early stage project that's been tested in probably less than 100 patients, was an extremely high valuation. Now, subsequently in January, a lot of these CAR T stocks have sold off. I can't take the credit for that. I know it sort of coincides a little bit with my report going out, but a number of other things have happened. A lot of the banks initiated on Juno after the IPO quiet period ended. A lot of them had sort of expressed some of these doubts. There was a Reuters article that appeared that said, hang on a minute, this is sort of running away with itself. So there's been a little bit of the deflation of that enthusiasm. That said, Juno's still worth, I think, over $3 billion. Kite is up there, so that, there's still a fair degree of enthusiasm, although I think it's a bit more measured now. I guess as investors will be looking to see, what the next sort of triggers are, and perhaps looking at a bit of the earlier stage companies, which might be a little bit more affordable at this present time.
Your report does highlight several concerns which you feel are still being largely ignored. I thought we could walk through some of those. What do we know about the safety of these therapies at this point?
What we know is that they can cause some very serious toxicities. In fact, I think the most prominent example of this was last year when a study of one of the immunotherapies was halted because of 2 patient deaths. Basically, you've got neurotoxicity, and you've got this thing called cytokine release syndrome, or cytokine storm. They are basically effects of huge stimulation of the immune system. And it's one issue that the industry right now is, well, it's working hard to address. It should probably be the main thing that should be being addressed at the moment. So that's still a. I think if you talk to some of the doctors, they'll say, well, this is kind of manageable, etc., etc. But I think from a regulatory point of view, some people think that none of these therapies will be approved by the FDA without some mechanism to control toxicity.
How about the efficacy? A lot of these are still early stage, but how clear a view do we have on efficacy?
Well, as I say, the efficacy is striking in some patients, but not all. I think more work has to be done on sort of relapses. Some of these patients that respond strongly do relapse. And I think more has to be done to characterize the types of relapses. For instance, some patients relapse because for whatever reason, the CAR T cells aren't very long lasting. Other patients relapse because the antigen, in this case CD19 antigen, has waned, so there's no longer anything for the CAR T cells to target. Now, I think more work has to be done to characterize that and to address that. For instance, a couple of the groups have been looking at giving patients who relapse a second dose of CAR T therapy targeting a different antigen, which again is a realistic possibility. It makes sense scientifically. Whether that makes sense when you add up the costs, well, that's a huge question.
Well, what about the durability? Are we seeing this actually curing people, or is there a sense that this is good and take you to a relapse at X number of years?
I suppose that depends on your definition of a cure. When you see some of these patients, a year or 2 years on still responding, that's pretty extraordinary. But you're right. For some of them, the next stage is simply a stem cell transplant, and that again adds more cost and could undermine a lot of the investment case for some of these companies. If you just add up the cost, that basically becomes unsustainable. If you're saying a CAR T therapy is merely a bridge to a transplant, well, you can see that probably makes little sense, certainly financially, when you've already got the huge cost of a transplant.
Well, we're certainly facing much greater scrutiny on pricing, and particularly with autologous cell therapies, these are going to be expensive. How tough a problem will these companies have in making a case for the value of their treatments?
I think they could have a considerable problem unless they can show more specific efficacy. Perhaps if they can obviously they're going to control the toxicity. That's given. But if you can position this as a replacement, for instance, in these childhood blood cancers, as a replacement for stem cell transplantation, well, that would be a pretty good case because you're effectively, the cost consideration would be less. So I think one of the doctors that I listened to said, well, if this could be a replacement for transplantation, that would be a holy grail. Whether we're there yet, I don't know. Whether the industry needs to make a stronger case for that and to show that that's what they're doing, well, again, if you're a skeptic here, you might very well think that in the lack of that type of benefit, that type of cost, case, then it would be very, very hard for these therapies to be supportable in the market.
One of the risks you highlight, which I was a little surprised to learn about, is the rather confused intellectual property environment in the space.
Yes.
Why is that, and how much of a problem might this be?
Well, that's a great point, and I think again in this wave of enthusiasm, I think a lot of people have lost sight of the fact that the IP position here is still it's a mess, it's a hornet's nest. What you've had basically is you've had a number of scientists in a number of prominent medical institutions working on these types of therapies for, as I say, for years, for 20 years in some cases. They've been sharing data, and while there were no great advances being made, that was fine. No one really cared about that commercially. Now that you've suddenly seen these amazing advances in certain cancers, and you start taking this commercially and you start forming companies around it, everyone stops and thinks, oh, hang on, where's the IP? I mean, you just have to look at the collaborators with Novartis, who were the University of Pennsylvania. They were involved in a lengthy legal action with Juno in the last couple of years over the IP here. You've got Juno sub-licensing a CAR-T CD22 project, which apparently is also being used by the NCI, which is a Kite collaborator. You've got Kite Pharma recently naming a person to head up the IP efforts entirely. I mean, this is heading for a major minefield of legal actions, in my opinion. And I mean, as an outsider, a lot of, I don't exactly know where this is going. I'm not sure whether a lot of investors are aware of where this is going to end up. Maybe it won't be until a sort of complex network of cross-licensing agreements are signed that we'll see any sort of progress commercially. But the IP, the patent issue in the background of all these therapies is a very big overhang, in my opinion.
Well, Novartis is one of the more compelling players in the space, but it's still a space dominated by young biotechs, and big pharma has largely been absent. Why do you think that is? Are they going to buy their way in when the space is to risk and there are clear winners and losers?
I think that's one possibility. I think the other is that the other goes down to pricing, the pricing of the companies, in other words, the market caps. And with some of the valuation of the more advanced players, I suspect a lot of big pharma companies are thinking this is way too expensive to go into at this point. You're right, Novartis is a very advanced player, in fact, possibly the most advanced of all of them. But Novartis was a very early adopter. I mean, Novartis struck a deal with University of Pennsylvania and the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia about, I think they've been working together for at least 2 years. So that's why Novartis is in there. I mean, the other thing you could look at, I suppose, if you're the CEO of Juno or of Kite Pharma and you see the valuation that the market is prepared to put on your company, well, why sell yourself? Maybe there's no imperative at all for them to sell themselves at this point. And in fact, you've seen them striking sort of fairly cautious deals with. Kite did a very early deal with Amgen, for instance, basically looking at new targets. But it's been a cautious entry of big pharma for whatever reason. I think it's also worth mentioning Pfizer, which has a deal with Cellectis, which is, Cellectis is a company that's interesting because they are one of the most prominent developers of this allogeneic approach. And again, I suppose Pfizer bought in quite early. They did this deal with Cellectis when it was still, not many people had heard about Cellectis because Cellectis had a different business plan at that point. So again, it was sort of a stealthy move by Pfizer to get in before the valuation became sort of too extortionate, I suppose.
Well, who's got the upper hand here? What's going to differentiate a player in what's become a crowded field?
Well, I think that's what investors are trying to find out right now. I mean, it's one of these areas where, you know, a lot of the times in biotech you've got clear data readouts, you've got signals, triggers, binary events. Right now, what you've got is a load of players who are running mostly open label studies, and you know, periodic updates will be given to these studies at scientific meetings this year. You know, ASCO probably is going to be huge. I expect the ASH meeting in December will be huge again. I suppose what investors will be waiting for is, especially at the current valuation, any more signs of toxicity, any more of these serious adverse events, because that's got the chance to put a major dampener on things. You know, the differentiating factor could be just the company that gets to the market first with a therapy that happens not to be associated with some of these very serious side effects. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. The other thing it's worth to say also is that, I mean, this is, despite the advances that have been seen in these blood cancers, I mean, this is still very early days. And a lot of people think that, you know, the real potential of these therapies, if they work in these sort of initial settings, the real therapy is going to be novel targets and, you know, solid tumors. I mean, solid tumors are, for a number of scientific reasons, they're far more difficult to target with this type of therapy. But, you know, another differentiating factor is going to be new targets. I mean, you know, everyone's looking at CD19. So, you know, that's crowded. So what do you do to get away from the crowd? Well, you can look for other hematological cancer targets. You can look at targets in, you know, other solid tumors and so on and so forth. So to that extent, you know, this what we've seen now, this early work really is, it's almost like a sort of exploratory foray to prove the concept of this theory, you know, before the real potential is unleashed. If you're bullish on the sector, that would be your view, I think.
Jacob Plieth, senior reporter for EP Vantage. Jacob, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks very much for having me.
A few housekeeping notes. Over on our sister podcast, Rarecast, tune in to hear Bill Elder Jr., a cystic fibrosis patient, discuss his experience with the breakthrough therapeutic Kalydeco and how he became the symbol of President Obama's precision medicine initiative. Then tune in February 6th to hear Hud Freeze, director of the Human Genetics Program at Sanford Burnham Medical Research Institute, discuss the upcoming World Rare Disease Day and the role awareness plays in increasing research and improving diagnoses. And next week on the Bio Report, Amy Miller of the Personalized Medicine Coalition discusses President Obama's new precision medicine initiative. Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.